With me in the studio, criminal lawyer Solomon Friedman. Katie Simpson is covering the trial for CTV News. And joining us from Halifax, author and journalist Dan Leger, who wrote the book, Duffy, Stardom to Senate Scandal. So first question to you, Katie. It starts on Monday, as we know. What's the lay of the land? Who's up first? How long is this trial expected to go?
Well, 2 weeks have been set aside for closing arguments, but the judge was very clear in saying, I hope this does not go for 2 weeks. Both sides have to present their written arguments while they present their cases, so that's going to help the judge sort of navigate the waters. The Crown is going to go first, then Don Bain will get his chance to present his closing arguments, and then the Crown will get a chance to reply. And they did it in that way because there were concerns that Don Bain might go on a little too long. So in the most efficient way possible, they've set it up. Crown goes first, then defense. Crown can reply, and they hope it won't take 2 weeks.
So Dan, when you wrote the book on Duffy, I don't know whether you've had a chance to talk to him, or have you talked to him? And second of all, do you get a sense that there's much interest in the Duffy trial now that the election is over and people have moved on with looking at the Trudeau government?
Well, Duffy isn't communicating with me anymore, Bob, and hasn't really since the book came out. And, you know, I don't blame him, I guess. I also don't blame him for keeping his mouth shut, given the amount of trouble he's in. But yeah, I think interest in the trial has definitely ebbed in view of the fact the election's over. We're no longer taking shots at a senator who was named by the sitting prime minister, or are we examining really anymore the fundraising and internal politics of the Conservative Party? All that has been laid bare. So in other words, I think, you know, the damage has been done by this trial. I think the Duffy case was a fairly significant factor in the defeat of Stephen Harper and the Conservatives, but people are moving on.
The Crown is going to be up first. I don't know whether it's going to be Mark Holmes or Jason Neubauer. Both of them are I guess, very experienced Crown prosecutors. But lay out what you think they would be doing tomorrow morning.
Well, what I expect to happen, given the multiplicity of counts here, they'll likely divide up the work. So Mark Holmes will deal with some, Jason Neubauer will deal with others. They may divide it up in terms of law and facts. That happens often. But the most important thing for them to do is to ensure that although Duffy may have raised some doubt on some of the evidence for some of the counts, that there are still, specifically with regards to the fraudulent counts, enough evidence to get proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I think that they've conceded, obviously not out loud, but in their minds, they're not going to win everything. But the point is, there are some counts here that surely, when it comes to the expenses at the very least, must result in convictions. I think that's going to be the thrust of their argument. Not to allow just doubt to be thrown up, which would obscure everything, but to really pick out this evidence remained unchallenged. This evidence remained unchallenged. We have the photos, the makeup, etc., the personal training. Those are problems for Duffy. Leave aside, perhaps, the housing expenses and the question of the $90,000 check.
Okay, so Katie, you watched Don Bain, who is Mr. Duffy's lawyer. He's a credible performer, probably one of the country's preeminent lawyers. What do you think his game plan is?
Well, through this entire case, we've seen Don Bain try to paint Mike Duffy as a victim, and I would expect that to continue as he does present his closing arguments. He has said that he was forced to go along with this by the PMO because it was embarrassing for the Prime Minister's office. And when he dragged all of those emails into court to show just how damaging and how much press the Senate scandal, expense scandal was getting, he presented the argument that the PMO wanted this scandal to go away. They wanted Mike Duffy to go along with their plan so that it finally was out of the headlines, but Mike Duffy continued to push back, he says, and didn't want to go along with it. And so I expect that that's what we're going to hear from Don Bain as it goes forward. And Mike Duffy, in his testimony, really presented himself as, I was trying to make the country a better place. Whether the judge believes that or not, again, that's up to the judge. Solomon
is saying that when you come down to that issue of the money, that $65,000 given to Duffy's friend, that was transferred to Duffy's friend, and then some of it went to a trainer and whatnot, that is where he might potentially get convicted. And if he is convicted, and if it's a 2-year sentence, he's gone from the Senate.
Yeah, any conviction is going to mean the end of his career in the Senate. You know, this is extremely dire. I mean, even if Mike Duffy doesn't go to prison, say, it still could have the effect of really damaging the individual, you know, damaging Mike Duffy so he can't earn a living. And it may do just as much damage, shall we say, as putting a guy in jail. So There's a lot on the line. There's a lot at stake for Mike Duffy in the next few days, and he's going to be rooting for Don Bain every minute of the day.
So, Solomon, take us through the three principal charges that were laid against them, one involving the $90,000, the housing allowance. You see more trouble for them in terms of the fraud charges.
I do. And, of course, the Crown needs to prove fraud, which is fraudulent intent, which is a dishonest action and an intent to deceive beyond a reasonable doubt. The trouble here is that there are so many difficulties, both with what appear to be bogus travel expenses, bogus personal expenses. The personal trainer is really the cherry on top. And I don't know that the explanation that was for research into the health and fitness of Canada's seniors is going to wash. Maybe on the other hand, Mike Duffy can point and say that, it wasn't for personal training purposes. This was set up through a contract. It's a difficult argument to accept. But the two other charges, which are the housing expenses, it's difficult to prove because Duffy sort of has the perfect defense. No less an authority than Stephen Harper told me that I was a resident of Prince Edward Island. How did he tell me? He told me I was entitled to sit as a senator. I wouldn't be entitled to sit as a senator if I wasn't a resident. That's what the Constitution says. So that's pretty difficult. That doesn't mean that the expenses weren't improper, they weren't obscene, and Canadians shouldn't be offended by them, but that it shouldn't result in a conviction on the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Then we come to the Nigel Wright matter, and I really think that Don Bain did a good job in terms of muddying the waters on the Nigel Wright check. There's no question Duffy received the check. But what the Crown needs to prove is two important things. Number one, that he was soliciting a benefit. And if we buy the story that this was being foisted upon Duffy, that goes away. We also have to believe that he was intending to offer something in return, right? There's two parts to a bribe, money and a benefit. What was he giving the Conservatives in return? That's very difficult, especially without Nigel Wright being charged. It becomes even more muddy. So I don't think that that's the strong charge. Where we have fraud, however, that is taking something that you're not entitled to. That's how, Mark Holmes put it very simply. This is about stealing paper clips, whether it's $1, $10,000. You can't defraud your employer. And ultimately, I believe that this is where the case is going to rest.
I'm assuming that everybody, including Pamela Wallin, I should say, who is also under investigation for very similar activities, they've got to be watching this case with a great deal of interest because whatever that judge decides, that's going to have an effect on whether they are charged.
And absolutely. And we saw when the Duffy trial was being scheduled that they actually put Mac Harb's case on hold because everyone was so interested in how this was going to play out that it was going to, the Crown and the defense both came to that agreement. Will some of these charges stick? Don Bain, as you mentioned, has done he's very skilled at what he does and has sort of muddied the waters in some of those housing expenses, which are similar to some of where the investigations are going with other senators. So it's going to take some time before the judge actually makes his judgment. There's 31 charges. That could take a very long time to sort through.
So Dan, what's your sense of if Mr. Duffy, for some reason or another, manages to get off on all of these charges, can he recover his reputation?
Yeah, well, 2 points there. The first one is we all keep forgetting about Raymond Lavigne, the Liberal senator who was charged with things very similar to what Mike Duffy is facing and was convicted and did go to jail. Is that a precedent? We'll see. On the second point, Mike Duffy doesn't have to get elected. He's a senator. There are senators in there who've got pretty bad reputations as it is. I can't see how his reputation would recover. I know he has a group of good, solid, dependable friends who have stuck with him through thick and thin, and they think Mike was unduly singled out for harassment by the authorities. But in terms of his public image, which was, he was one of Canada's best-known journalists. He was a household name. People would flock to him to get their pictures taken with him and get his autograph and things like that. I got to think that part of his life is over, and he's got to carry on as best he can with whatever the future brings.
Thank you very much. Great talking to you. We'll be looking forward to that trial starting tomorrow.